So when we broke, right before we broke for lunch, you told the jurors about your background and education and training in this area. And I believe you left off, you mentioned that in this case specifically, you were asked to conduct what's called a type and caliber analysis of 2 fired cartridge cases that you looked at in the lab. Is that an accurate summary?
Yes.
Okay. In order to illustrate some of the topics that you're going to be discussing today, did you create a PowerPoint presentation that addresses the type of exam that you did and illustrates the various terms that are going to come up throughout this examination?
I did.
Okay. Now, I'd asked to mark my next exhibit, EBD 43, with Mr. Biraimah's PowerPoint presentation. Can you see it on the screen?
This
let me turn on your little screen. Let me make it easier. So you don't have to constantly turn around. Good.
Yes.
All right. Is this the presentation that you created for this case?
It is.
I'm going to go forward to slide number 2. Can you tell the jurors what we see on this slide?
Sure. Well, in the course of this examination, there's a few different areas of basics that will, I think, help the jury understand the fundamentals of what we're talking about, and then actually the conclusions at the end of the examination. These topics are separated on this slide. They include firearm identification, cartridge components, pistol discharge, type and caliber determination, evidence features, ghost guns, and my ultimate findings.
Okay. We go forward to start with the first topic on your list, which was firearm identification. If you would tell the jurors what generally firearm identification is.
Yes, so within forensic science, there is a large discipline called tool mark identification. So this is simply the practice of looking at marks that are caused when a harder object impacts a softer object. Sometimes those marks can actually give us information about the objects involved. Firearm identification, what most people would call ballistic comparison, is really a subset of tool mark comparison, in which that tool is actually a firearm.
You talked about different types of tool marks. Can you discuss that just a little bit more for the jury? What it is that you're looking at when you do a tool mark identification examination?
Yes. Well, the tool is simply the harder of the two objects in forcible contact. The reason we use that word is because this is often performed using hand tools like chisels or bolt cutters. If they're used in many different types of incidents, property crimes and such, they can leave marks on items that they've come into contact with. Those types of marks vary. There's 2 different general types. The first is an impression. An impression is straightforward contact between the harder and softer object under pressure. The striation includes that contact, but it also includes lateral motion. So essentially, an impression is a dent, and a striation is a microscopic scrape mark.
Okay. Can you talk to the jurors how this relates specifically to firearms?
Yes, well, the discharge of a gun releases immense pressures. It does so quickly that we often don't think about it. The pressure you use to actually inflate a tire is maybe on the order of 35 pounds per square inch. A 9mm Luger cartridge, when it discharges, releases pressures around 35,000 pounds per square inch, or PSI. These are just immense pressures, and they slam ammunition components into the gun. And that's the forcible contact that we're talking about during a firearm identification tool mark generation.
You talked about term that I had, fire ammunition components. Would a cartridge case be, or a cartridge be one of those ammunition components?
Yes, a cartridge case is part of a live round of ammunition or a cartridge. That's one of the types of components that we examine. Okay.
If you would, I want to talk in more detail about the cartridge specifically and its components. Go on to the next slide. Would you explain to the jury the cartridge?
Yes. So a lot of times people will say to fire a gun, you load it with bullets. That's not exactly true. What you need is a round of ammunition, also known as a cartridge. The top left image there, you see an actual photograph of a few cartridges. And in the larger portion of this diagram, there's a simplistic diagram of one round of ammunition. It has a few different parts. The first part is that cartridge case. It's a brass cup that essentially holds all the other components together. Jammed into the mouth of that cartridge case is the bullet. This is the actual projectile that's going to travel from the gun towards the target. Within the cartridge, you'll see some grayish material. This is the propellant or gunpowder. And at the very rear of the cartridge is the primer. This is a small metal cup. It contains some shock-sensitive explosive. When this primer is struck by a portion of the gun, called the firing pin, it explodes, causes the powder to burn very rapidly. At this point, the cartridge sort of functions like a champagne bottle being popped. The bullet is going to leave the cartridge like the cork from a champagne bottle. The cartridge case, that brass cup, is going to remain in the firearm at least for a period of time.
Okay. Moving on to the next slide. Can you explain to the jurors the different parts that we see here in slide number 10?
Yes, slide 11.
Sorry, my apologies.
No problem. It essentially is just showing you another depiction of what we just spoke about. So here we have two live cartridges on the outside of this photograph. Each of those is ready to actually be loaded and fired. Just inward from those, you'll see two cartridges of the same types, which I've actually pulled apart. So here you can see at the bottom, there is the cartridge case, that gold-colored round item with the writing on it that's facing us. The primer is in the center of that. The grayish black powder material there is the propellant that's actually going to give the discharge its pressure. And at the very top of the center of the photo are two different bullets. These are typically going to be copper wrapped around a heavy lead core, and that's the projectile that travels through the barrel towards the target.
Okay. Now let me understand the components of the cartridge. I want you to explain to the jurors the discharge process, if you would. Let me get to the next slide. Can you describe for the jurors what we see here?
Right, so here we have a simplified diagram of a cartridge that's positioned within a semi-automatic pistol so that it can be fired. The cartridge is located in essentially a tube called the barrel. It holds that cartridge and it will guide the barrel bullet as it exits the gun towards the target. This cartridge is in the unfired state and it's ready to discharge.
And you said this illustration specifically is of a semi-automatic handgun, correct?
Correct.
All right, I'm going to click it, and it will show us sort of the actions or what's happening within the gun at the time the trigger is pulled and the cartridge is fired, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Can you describe for the jurors what the action was or what we saw in motion on that animation?
Yes, so the first cartridge has discharged. The propellant burned and the bullet went down the barrel towards the right side of the image. At that same time, That pressure is actually going to be harnessed by the mechanism within the gun. It will cause the top of the gun, it's called the slide, to recoil, to move to the rear. This is going to use some of that energy from the first cartridge that's fired in order to prepare the gun to be fired again by a second pull of the trigger.
Okay. Would you describe the kind of bluish tinted area that we see in the handle of the gun there?
Yes, so that's depicting what's called a magazine. This component will actually be inserted inside the grip of this type of firearm. Magazine holds rounds of ammunition, stores them within the gun until they're ready to be fired. Essentially, it works like a Pez dispenser, if you're familiar with that, without the plastic head. So it's a box, it's got a spring in the bottom, and it pushes the cartridges towards the top. When the first cartridge fires, the top of that gun reciprocates, and you saw it move. This allows the gun to first remove the extended cartridge case from the chamber where a live cartridge needs to be positioned to fire a second time. It reloads that chamber with the top cartridge that's in the magazine, and it also resets the internal mechanism of that gun. When we say that a gun is semi-automatic, that specifically means that every time you pull the trigger, one cartridge is fired. It's going to function like a Windex bottle. I can hold the trigger all day, no more ammunition is going to be expended. So that is semi-automatic, as opposed to full automatic would function like an aerosol can. I hold the trigger and it will continue firing until the source of ammunition is depleted.
When you talked about the expended cartridge, that's the piece of the cartridge case that's left in the gun after the bullet comes out for what would be essentially a fraction of a second, correct?
Yes, that's the cartridge case. That's the brass cup. It's depicted in gold color on these particular diagrams. And that is the part that will be expended and ejected from the chamber.
How does that happen? How does it eject out of the gun?
Again, this is one of the functions that the mechanism is doing when it harnesses that energy. After discharge, there's a small hook in the gun called an extractor. It's going to pull that cartridge case out of the chamber rearward from the barrel. It's going to hit another implement called the ejector. At that point, it's going to be flipped out of the gun. It essentially will appear like if you flipped a quarter as hard as you could towards your right shoulder. So that expended cartridge case will be cleared from the gun and remain in the vicinity typically.
And is that action that you just described consistent among all semi-automatic firearms?
Yes, to fire a semi-automatic gun, such as depicted here, more than once, you will have to clear the chamber of that expended cartridge case. It's a necessity to fire multiple.
We've covered this a couple of times, so if you would just briefly talk about what the distinction between that action would be versus a revolver.
So a revolver uses a different mechanism. You may have seen these in Western type movies. Rather than having a magazine and a single chamber, there's a part called a cylinder. This is a cylindrical component that can be loaded with a number of cartridges. That component will then be rotated, bringing each cartridge in line with the barrel one by one, so that each can be fired. After that cartridge is fired, the cartridge case in a revolver will remain in the chamber of that cylinder until it is manually extracted and ejected from the gun.
Okay. Move on to the barrel of the gun. When you talk about what happens in the barrel when the gun is discharged.
Right, so this is the portion of the gun that's most interesting to a firearm examiner during discharge. So I just enlarged that tube, the barrel. The rear part, you can see it's specifically made to accept that cartridge. That's the chamber. The entire device runs off of pressure. So the rear of that barrel has to be closed off. This will be accomplished by a surface that's called the breech face. It's illustrated here in that bluish green. In the center of that breech face, there is a hole or a channel that allows the firing pin to protrude and strike the cartridge and initiate the discharge.
Now, specifically with the examination you did in this case, would you agree that a lot of the information that you were looking at comes from that area around where the breech face, the aperture, and the firing pin are?
Yes, a great deal of the information for cartridge cases in general, and in this examination in particular, will come from that portion of the firearm.
Because it's important to this examination, would you just highlight with the pointer exactly where those three different features are? The breech face, the aperture, and the firing pin?
Sure. So the breech face is going to be the forward surface of this blue block that's simplified for the purposes of the diagram. You'll see this channel that's meant to depict an opening in this solid breech face. The very opening forward portion of that channel is called the firing pin aperture. It's just the name we use for that hole, the opening. And depicted in orange, this simple cylindrical implement is the firing pin that will be propelled forward, strike the primer, and initiate discharge.
You said in your examination in this case, you looked at two of those fired cartridge cases, those brass cups, as you talked about, correct?
Correct.
You did not specifically evaluate any actual guns in your examination in this case, correct?
Correct.
So how is it that you were able to see any of the information that would come from the gun, meaning the breech face, the firing pin, or the aperture, if you didn't have a gun and all you had was that brass piece that was ejected from the gun?
Right, so again, this is an effect of those immense pressures and forces that are involved in discharge. Someone about my size stepped on a soda can. I'm exerting, I believe it's about 5 pounds per square inch. You can imagine that surface of the street could then cause dents into that soda can. Here we're talking about pressures in the order of 35,000 pounds per square inch. These are acting on surfaces of the cartridge case, which are not much harder or much different than you might find in the soda can. This allows just huge amounts of information to be imprinted into the material of the cartridge case, allowing type and caliber determinations to occur, giving it a job.
Okay. Look forward to the actual discharge process. Can you describe what we see on slide 19?
Sure, so it is depicted that firing pin coming forward, slamming into the primer, initiating discharge. Once that bullet has moved to the end of the tip of my finger, it is moving at the speed of a commercial jet, and it's rotating now at maybe 60,000 to 80,000 rotations per minute. So a great deal of energy has been released. The bullet's on its way out of the gun through the barrel, and pressure is slamming that cartridge case into the surfaces of the gun. This allows that firing pin to leave an impression. The firing pin aperture itself can be impressed into that primer with such a force that we can see the actual imprint, and also breech face markings. The small imperfections of that breech face can actually be impressed into the surface of the cartridge case, just as you would impress a fingerprint into a lump of clay.
Okay. This is an illustration that you have on in slide 19, correct?
Yes.
Did you put actual examples of these different components, the breech face, the apertures, in your presentation?
There are, yes, some exemplars. There's only one, I believe, that's related to this case. These images, such as the firearm you're seeing, are unrelated examples.
Okay. What specifically are you showing here in slide number 21?
So what you just saw was a gun that's slowly been disassembled to show you the internal parts that are going to be in contact with the cartridge during discharge. We're looking at the left side of the image. We're looking rearward at that breech face. This is the surface that will close off the back door of that barrel, the tube behind that live cartridge. The main area is tinted blue there. That is the breech face surface. You look towards the center, you'll see a dotted line. I just added that dotted line around that opening. That opening is the actual firing pin aperture. And within the opening, you'll see an orangish, sort of elongated implement. That's the firing pin. On the right side of that diagram, you'll see an illustration of the types of marks that we'll talk about. The blue area, that circular area, is the primer. It's a soft metal where that explosion happens on the other side of it. Marks from the breech face can come over. You'll see that dotted line outlining the firing pin aperture, and an actual impression into the material from the firing pin striking and causing discharge.
Okay, you said the illustration or the animation of the gun slowly being taken apart. I'm going to just go back so we can follow what you were showing. It goes by a little quickly, so I'm going to play it again.
Sure, so the top is a slide and barrel. Now I've taken the slide and the barrel apart. Here we're looking at the slide, which has that breech face surface within it.
Okay. I'm going to go on to slide number 22. Would you describe what you're illustrating here?
So a typical firearm identification task will often include what we call an actual microscopic comparison. I'll use an instrument to look at the tool marks on two items such as cartridge cases with the aim of trying to determine if they are fired by the same particular source. You could come to an opinion that they were fired by the same gun, or an opinion that they were not fired by the same gun, meaning they've been eliminated. That information is typically most useful when there is a gun in evidence. So here we just sort of depicted that there's a firearm. Test fires from that firearm can be compared to the two evidence cartridge cases connected with the dotted lines down there. The cartridge cases depicted in different colors are sort of just indicating that sometimes the features of those actual marks will be sort of an apples and oranges situation. And we can tell, even without looking at the microscopic markings, that they were fired from different guns.
You said that what's displayed up here would be an identification that you can make if you had a gun to actually compare the fired cartridge cases to, correct?
That's when it's most useful? Yes.
If you hypothetically had received a gun in this case to compare to the two fired cartridge cases, could you determine scientifically if that particular gun that was provided to you was the one that fired these cartridge cases?
I could perform a side-by-side microscopic comparison on a comparison microscope. If the marks are of sufficient quality, it may allow me to come to the opinion that, yes, the reason for the agreement of those marks is I'm of the opinion that they were fired in the same gun. Conversely, it could lead us to the opinion that they were not fired in the same gun.
That was my next question, was if you were provided, hypothetically, if you were provided a gun to compare to two fired cartridge cases, you could also definitively say, looking at these individual marks, that that gun was not used to fire those cartridge cases. Is that what you're saying? Is that correct?
Yes. There's identification, same gun. elimination. They were not fired in the same gun. If there's any deficiencies with the items, we can just say inconclusive, meaning I can't give you any definitive.
Okay, and that's if you have a gun. But if you don't have a gun, what are you looking at? In a case like this, where what you would call a no gun.
Right, so you can perform that comparison with two cartridge cases collected in the same area. But again, it does not tend to give you much additional information. What we will tend to do, if you just had two items collected at a crime scene, for instance, is perform what's called a type and caliber determination. So here we would be trying to characterize or describe types of guns which we know to produce marks, such as those that we see on the evidence.
Okay. Which gets into the analysis that you did the type and caliber, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Let's talk about caliber first, or how you do these types of analysis.
Right, so this is basically reiterating what I just discussed. So type and caliber, we're leaning towards trying to determine two different groups of information. First, the caliber, the specific type of ammunition, the size of ammunition that the unknown gun is intended to fire. And then we will actually look at the marks on the exhibit to see if we can begin to list some brands of firearms which we know to produce similar marks.
Okay, when you're looking at fired cartridge cases, is it difficult to determine what the caliber is?
Cartridge cases, it is not so difficult. They have a portion on the rear of the cartridge case surrounding that primer that typically has what we call a head stamp, meaning that the manufacturer has stamped in usually some identifying information about who made the cartridge, and also the caliber of firearm it's intended to be used with.
Okay. Moving on, can you describe the illustration you have here in slide 27?
Right, so this is just to get a sense of that type of caliber examination. Imagine that you have a clean kitchen floor and 30 seconds later you have a muddy footprint right in the middle of it. Something we're just instinctively going to do is look at the basic size of that footprint. At this point, we're probably going to narrow it down to some of your family members as opposed to others. You could look closer into that footprint, and if you see a particular design that is typical of a particular brand of shoe, this can further narrow sort of your list of suspects in your household. Type and caliber determination is essentially you're just doing that same process, but we're doing it using ammunition components, which is a little bit of a different exercise.
Yeah, different.
Just following your illustration of the muddy shoe print, are you saying that if you were to look at a muddy shoe print on the floor and see that it was a smaller size, you may eliminate that, oh, it was an adult that contributed to this footprint because it's too small to be an adult shoe, something like that?
Correct.
All right. And then if you have multiple children in your household, are you saying you could look at the pattern of the muddy footprint and say if my son wears Converse but my daughter wears Reeboks, that you could eliminate one just based on the pattern that you see in the mud?
Right, and you're using patterns that are common to other Converse shoes out there. You aren't linking it to one particular shoe, but you're able to sort out this list of limited suspects.
So if you have 3 kids and 2 of them were Converse and 1 of them wore Reeboks, you could eliminate the Reebok, but you wouldn't be able to distinguish between the 2 Converse. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Right. You've narrowed it to 2 potential culprits and eliminated 1.
Okay. Let's go on to talking about caliber with cartridges.
Can't wait for cross.
Okay, so caliber is another term that people pick up from movies and TV, but
All right, and remember, or if you haven't heard it yet, there is a firearms instructor on the jury. So that means she teaches courses. I don't know specifically on what, maybe like concealed carry. I don't know exactly. An instructor, not an expert witness, but someone that deals with firearms. Now, I wonder if they're familiar with stuff like this, where, just because we can look at a Converse print and tell that it was a Converse, or we look at an aspen tree and we know it's an aspen because it's an aspen. What they're trying to compare with the shoe print comparison is, if it's a Converse print, it's a Converse. We might not know who was wearing it, but if we end up saying it's a size 9 Converse and this person also has a size 9 Converse, it's a pretty good link. But here, what they're going to be able to tell us about this caliber match is this shell casing is 9 caliber, and based on the markings, this markings could be consistent with a Glock 43 firing it. But that doesn't mean that another make couldn't have fired it. For their ballistics report, from my understanding, it's not constrained to just one type, make, and model gun. So, I feel like the shoe print thing is quite misleading. But, again, we'll get to cross.
It has a specific meaning. So, if you were to pick up a flashlight in one aisle of a store and a battery in another aisle, you're going to select the proper compatible items based on that size system. For instance, you're going to pick a AA battery. It allows you to match up the right battery with the right flashlight.
Billy had 5
Caliber is a similar system for ammunition. It's a matchmaking system that allows us to put the right ammunition into the right type of firearm. So saying a gun is of a particular caliber is like saying a battery is of a AA size.
Okay. Going on, are there common calibers that you see in your laboratory?
Yes, there are hundreds in existence, but most of the work that we actually see day to day will come from a relatively small grouping, maybe 20 to 2 dozen different calibers.
This is actually very helpful for the defense. Most of the different cases, unrelated cases, all the cases that we look at, it's just, about 2 dozen different calibers that we deal with. So most casings come from a limited pool of calibers, which means what? More people could be the source. More things could be the source of the same thing.
That are commonly encountered in a crime.
Talk about caliber, and then talk about type. What do you mean when you say type in a type and caliber analysis?
Right, so it's kind of a vague term, but what we mean by type is that even when we're looking at these marks, even very simple implements like that firing pin are very carefully designed. That specific design may be common to a group of firearms, so by examining the imprint of particular features, we can begin to associate a mark with a group of firearm brands which we know to produce similar implements.
Can you describe the different, well, describe first what a class characteristic is and then what the different class characteristics are when you're talking about cartridges?
So a class characteristic is a feature which is going to be common not just to one item, but to a class or a group of items of a similar design. So a particular shape of firing pin may be common to firearm brands X, Y, and Z. This group of X, Y, and Z is a smaller, more restricted group of the potential brands out there. When we do a type and caliber analysis, we're using these features. We call them class characteristics. When looking at a cartridge case, some of the most important class characteristics will be the caliber, the shape of that firing pin aperture, as well as the shape of the firing pin itself.
And again, the aperture is the hole that's in the breech face, correct?
Yes, it's like the donut hole in that breech face, and that actual shape can be impressed onto the discharge cartridge case.
And the firing pin is the piece that strikes the primer that, as it strikes it, it also leaves an imprint of the shape of the firing pin?
That's correct.
Okay. Can you talk about the class characteristics you see up here?
So this is just sort of illustrating that process of narrowing our candidates. So we begin with the caliber. At the bottom left, this is just an image of a cartridge from the laboratory. You'll see at the center that circle is the primer, and you'll see writing impressed in the outside of that primer. That's called a headstand. It's placed there by the cartridge manufacturer. And simply by reading this headstand, also comparing the basic dimensions of that cartridge case, we can determine the caliber of the cartridge. So this particular one is a caliber called 9mm Luger.
Okay, the next class characteristic?
Again, to describe that hypothetical firing pin aperture, this is a laboratory gun. We're looking at that breech face. The dark circle in the center is that hole, the firing pin aperture. The firing pin is going to protrude from that hole upon discharge. And the shape of that hole may vary. Some of the shapes that we commonly run into would be round, which is pretty generic, a rectangular shape, or sometimes even a teardrop shaped aperture.
Now, when you talk about caliber, to the right of the word caliber there's 5 boxes that each have a number and some letters below it. Are those common calibers of cartridge cases that you see?
Right, so this is just illustrating a hypothetical, but these are 5 different common calibers.
Guys, I'm pretty sure it's been about an hour and a half, because he was on the stand for like 15 minutes before the break, that this guy's been up here and we haven't gotten to the casings in question. Have some mercy, Judge. Make this move along.
They usually have a very specific name that can be shortened and placed onto a cartridge headstand.
So a fire cartridge that you'll see will have a caliber associated to it, correct?
Yes.
And then it will have the aperture shape, which will be is more than likely to be one of those 3 shapes that you have listed up there, correct?
Very commonly, yes.
Okay. Sorry. Can you describe what you're showing with this next illustration when it comes to the aperture shapes?
Yes, so at the bottom of this illustration, we have images of 3 different cartridge cases, and these have accepted that imprint of the aperture shape. So at the right-hand side of that image, you'll see a dotted line outlining a circular aperture. In the center, the dotted line is outlining that rectangular shape aperture. And at the left side of the image, you'll see the dotted line that's actually in a teardrop-shaped configuration. So these are just examples of the different shapes that we'll be assessing.
And each one of those 3 is a different example, just showing the different shapes that you can see in 3 different guns, correct?
Yes.
Okay. The last class characteristic you talked about was the firing pin shape. Can you describe that for the jury?
Sure. In the bottom right, this is actually a magnified image of a firing pin. It's about the size of the tip of a ballpoint pen. This particular one is round or hemispherical. It's a very common shape of a firing pin. That round outline will then be imprinted into the cartridge that firing pin discharges. Again, there are different types that are commonly found to be manufactured by different brands. These again would be round, rectangular, and teardrop shaped. The aperture and firing pin shape do not have to match. So these different combinations give different classes their distinctive features.
So I just want to put a finer point on that. Just because the aperture of a firearm is round does not necessarily mean that the firing pin itself is also round. It can be a different shape.
Correct. It's up to the manufacturer, and they can combine those as they see fit.
Okay. All right. And then do you have examples of what those different firing pins looks like when you look at them in the laboratory?
Yes, so these are the same images. Here at the center, you'll see a depressed area that is then outlined with a solid yellow shape. So the right side, you'll see that the outline of the actual firing pin that was pressed into the surface is round. In the center, it is rectangular. We may also call this elliptical. And on the left-hand side is a more distinctive shape, that actual teardrop shape that can be caused by the firing pin itself.
Okay. Go on now. You said you actually did an examination in this case of 2 fired cartridge cases, correct?
Correct.
When you are assigned to do this type of analysis, a type and caliber analysis on fired cartridge cases, what's the first step that you take in the laboratory?
First step is to obtain the evidence. It's going to be actually stored with the property system. I'll go check out that evidence, bring it up, log it into our computer system, and perform an inventory of the evidence package.
In order to check the item out of evidence of property, how is it that you do that? Is there some number associated with it?
Yes, each investigation at LAPD receives a number. This has been called for most of my career a DR number. I think it means Division of Records number. This is simply a number that identifies a particular investigation. Evidence that's collected associated with that investigation will be filed under that DR.
The jury's awake. Brianna walked in during this testimony.
2106-18784.
May I refer to my notes?
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, 2106-18783.
All right. When you went to property division, did you obtain the envelope that we see here that was previously marked People's 32? And let me read that up there. Bring it to you if you need to inspect the envelope yourself.
Thank you. Yes, this is the envelope that I received.
Okay, and how is it that you recall that this was the specific envelope you received?
It bears the DR number as well as the number 1, meaning it is item number 1 booked to that DR number. On the back side of the envelope, it has my initials, my stylized initials, my serial number, as well as the date that I opened the package.
Okay, I see it. What I have frozen up on the screen there, is that the front side of the envelope?
Yes.
And putting up the back side, are these the initials that you were referring to?
Yes.
All right. Get out the smaller envelope. I'm going to show you the back side of the smaller envelope.
Finally getting to the casings, guys.
You approach the tapes and screen, let me know, but did you
A lot of tape.
receive this smaller envelope as well when you did your examination?
Yes, it bears my stylized initials and information.
Are they up here just below the tape?
Yes, that's where I marked the envelope when I opened it.
Okay. Then lastly, you take the 2 items out of the smaller envelope. Up here. You can approach with these if you would. You tell us that these are the fired cartridge cases that you examined in this case.
There never was a chain of custody anyway, Dick. This all started with Relly. Chloe is out here like a paper boy.
Yes, their external features match the features that I documented. And there are also engravings on the inside of the actual cartridge case. When I receive evidence, I will engrave it with the item number, portion of that ER number, my initials, and serial number inside the mount of the case where it will not obscure your eyes.
So that you know later that they're the same ones in the pack.
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna put them back. Smaller envelope. Back in the larger envelope of people's 32. So after you received that envelope and those specific cartridge cases, what's the next step that you take in your examination process?
So the next step is going to be filling out some worksheets with the basic observations and features that are observable on those items. Both of these were booked as item 1, so I did designate one of the two as item 1A, the other as 1B. Then I documented the material and general features that we will systematically do in the opening stages of an examination.
Okay, and then the next step after documentation, what did you do?
So that point would just be to sort of classify those actual markings that were observed, the aperture shape, the firing pin shape, and these are just outlined in preparation for the interpretation part of the actual analysis.
Okay, so you talked about in your prior testimony looking for those 3 class characteristics, the aperture shape, the firing pin shape, and the caliber, correct?
Yes, among others, but these are the most prominent and useful.
Okay. So is that what you're talking about when you look at them in the laboratory? You're documenting each one of those class characteristics.
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to go back to your presentation here. Now you're going to start talking about the specifics of this case, correct?
Correct.
All right. Let's start with slide 40. Can you describe for the jury what we see here?
Yes, so the photo at the right side of this this slide is a digital image that is from the computer database system. It's called NIBIN, N-I-B-I-N. This was taken before my actual analysis, but it's a good depiction of what I was looking at. In this picture, I've got the numbers 1, 2, and 3 there. So first, I've categorized the actual caliber. It is a 9 Luger caliber cartridge. Looking at the imprint on this of the aperture, I classified that as teardrop shaped. Looking closer into that actual depression in the primer, I classified the shape of the firing pin as also being teardrop shaped. So in the bottom left, there's a simple diagram outlining those features that I observed.
Okay. All right, let's go on to the next area. If you would describe sort of the value of the class characteristics that you observed, that information you just talked about.
Right. So now I'm beginning the interpretation stage of the examination. That first stage, here illustrated on the first line next to the one, is the determination of caliber. That was 9mm Luger. This is very common. In our lab, it's the most common caliber that we run into. So while that is interesting, it narrows our pool of candidate firearms to some extent. It's still a very common feature. Down at line 2, I'm then going to move to begin to interpret what does the teardrop shaped aperture mean. How does that allow me to further restrict the list of candidate sources?
Okay. Let's move on then. if you would, talk about after you document those three features, those three class characteristics, what's the next step that you took?
So at this stage, it becomes a bit of a research project. I'm using literature from my field in order to get the broadest list of known candidate sources with a teardrop-shaped firing pin aperture. The left side here is depicted just a couple of articles that I used. These are from the Journal of the Association of Firearm and Toolmark Examiners. This is a peer-reviewed journal that's been in print since 1968, I believe. A few of these articles started me down that path. There is also an electronic forum that's operated by AFTE. It's available to AFTE members, AFTE, Association of Firearm and Toolmark Examiners. This is an electronic exchange for professional examiners in a members area of the AFTE website. It allows them to interact and exchange information about new observations that they have in casework. And this is more responsive than the actual articles. We can disseminate information quicker by those means.
And these were the sources you used to kind of determine how big the pool was of potential candidates to compare to those three features.
Correct. I'm just looking for a list of suspect guns, if you will, brands which we know to include just that one feature, the teardrop-shaped firing pin aperture.
Okay. So it was specific to the firing pin aperture?
Correct.
All right, let's move on. What was the next step you took?
The next resource I used is called the Class Characteristics Matrix. This is a developing database, also operated by AFTE. It allows me to just, you may enter different features, such as caliber and firing pin aperture shape. I did so.
Hold on. Why did it get quiet? Why did it get quiet? Hold on, we're going to back out. We'll get the volume back up.
In order to try to broaden that list of potential makes known to the community to produce teardrop-shaped firing pin apertures.
Okay. After looking at those resources, what did you determine was the potential list of firearm manufacturers that could have contributed to that aperture?
Right. So from all the manufacturers operating, the list that is known to me as a result of consulting these sources comes down to just a list of about 5 different manufacturers. So we've narrowed that candidate group considerably just using that one feature. These images there are logos or images depicting those 5 sources.
Okay, so you went from 9mm, very common source, to now whittling it down to 5 manufacturers, just with the aperture shape, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. If you would talk about the kind of next step in your research project.
So moving from the aperture now to the actual firing pin. At this point, it becomes a little more challenging because the firing pin that I'm looking at in this case just happens to be quite distinctive. Fortunately, several months before the occurrence date of this case, I initiated a project where I collected samples from firearms that were coming through the firearm unit. We regularly test fire pistols that come into LAPD custody to be entered into the NIVIN database. I collected 229 different firearms examples, and these are specifically what we call ghost guns. It's a new sort of phenomena of firearms. By examining the samples from those this sample set, I was able to locate a few species that actually exhibited the firing pin consistent with the one that I observed in this case.
The teardrop shape, correct?
Teardrop-shaped firing pin, correct.
Okay. And when you add that or add that class characteristic to your analysis. So now you've gone from caliber, you've narrowed some out with the aperture shape, and now you've added in those that have the same aperture shape and this unique firing pin shape. What were you left with?
Right, so I'm left with the logo there you see on the left is not an actual manufacturer, it's just representing what we call ghost guns. So there's one particular aftermarket slide which is common to a particular frame size of ghost gun. That particular product exhibited the firing pin shape that I observed on the evidence. It also has some compatibility with frames that are produced by Glock.
Okay. Before we talk about ghost guns, you mentioned NIBIN. Would you describe for the jurors what that is and how you used it specifically in this case?
Sure. We may be more familiar with DNA databases. Samples from a crime scene may go into a database. Samples from suspects will also go into the database. The computer will attempt to match samples and potential suspects. We have a similar database in firearm identification. This is called NIBIN, the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network. So when we have a group of evidence cartridge cases, such as the ones in this case, we can enter it into the system and attempt to look for potential matches among tens of thousands of candidates that are in that system. At the conclusion of my examination, I took the actual items that were...
All right, guys, rate the NIBIN logo on a scale of 1 to 10 for graphics design. They've got the ammunition working out with those eyes and the dots there. What do you think? What do you think of this NIBIN logo on screen?
Previously imaged into the NIBIN system and had them correlated again. This means those images of our evidence were searched against the database again in order to see if I could find any other makes of firearms depicting that particular firing pin shape.
You described using the AFI resources, or the resources from your association of other tool mark examiners. Would NIBIN essentially have been kind of like a double check to your research that you did on the AFI resources?
Right, so the AFI resources, I'm trying to expand my list of possible candidates. I expanded that list, and those resources also told me what types of firing pins I expected to see. I didn't just take that at face value. I looked through NIBIN in order to attempt to confirm whether those resources were accurate. According to the samples that I looked at on this database, they were as advertised or published in those resources. Finally, I used NIBIN again as a second sort of double check, putting our actual evidence in and seeing if there are any other brands I'm unaware of that had similar marks.
Now let's talk about ghost guns. You used that term a couple times. If you would describe what a ghost gun is.
Sure. Well, this slide sort of depicts the, I guess, mainstream way of manufacturing and distributing firearms. So they're typically made by a licensed manufacturer, shipped to a retailer that has a federal firearms license, and they're sold to us in public from that retailer. So that is how typical guns are distributed. I say guns of typical manufacturer as opposed to the species that are commonly referred to as ghost guns.
Okay, moving on to that. Can you describe what you are illustrating here?
Right, so the ghost gun species uses a frame that is the portion you're going to grip. This is the part that needs to be serialized and controlled if it is manufactured and shipped to you, the consumer. Ghost guns use a product that is an incomplete frame. It requires you as the consumer to make just a few adjustments, drill a few holes in order to make that frame operational. You can order these over the internet. You can also order what's depicted there. The frame here is in that pink color. You're also going to need the other firearm components, such as the slide and the barrel. These can also be ordered online. Then, using simple hand tools, as most of us would have in our garage, these aftermarket parts can be assembled and to produce a functional gun. Now, this gun does not have a serial number in that state, because when it was shipped, when the frame was shipped from that manufacturer, it was shipped in an unfinished condition, which did not require it to have a serial number. This is where the term ghost gun, I think, is taken hold, because it does not have that serial number that's known to law enforcement.
You talked about three parts of the gun, and you said the pink part that you have illustrated up there is the frame. What are the other two parts? The gray rectangular shape on the top and the kind of orangish cylindrical piece underneath the pink part.
These are the main other components. Okay, so the pink part is that frame.
Yeah, I say let's talk about this, because now on the outside, we are aware of posts that Relly made years ago to his Instagram stories post where he has guns in a bag. He has two different handguns in, I don't know if he was traveling or whatever, but they're like under a shirt and he like lifts up and you can see them in the bag. But we had testimony today that back in 2021, when the detectives looked, they didn't see any firearms registered in Relly's name. But he was clearly in possession of some, according to his own Instagram stories that we've seen out here. What we're seeing at trial is this guy now talking about these ghost guns, but we also know that the weapons they found, any firearms they found at Rocky's house, they were all legally registered, either to himself or to his manager. So I think this is a great point. Teresa's saying, so you're saying the man who has registered guns in his name went out and also got a ghost gun. Could be possible, right? But very interesting when you have the star witness talking about, I don't know anything about firearms. I only got a firearm after this incident. Then we find out that that's not true.
That orange tubular shaped item is the barrel. That is where you load the cartridge, and that's where the bullet's actually going to travel, go towards the target. The gray object at the top of this image, that's the slide. It contains the breech face and the mechanism associated with the firing pin. Marks on the cartridge case are primarily coming from that component, the slide component of the firearm.
And are you illustrating that you can essentially purchase these individual pieces separately? So you could just buy a frame if you just wanted the frame?
Correct. You could buy the kit that can be used to produce a frame, and then the other components can be purchased separately from various retailers.
Okay. If you already have a working firearm, but you want to exchange a piece like the slide for the frame, can you do that by removing a piece and then adding an aftermarket piece?
Yes, you can. Just like my car has a license plate, it's licensed. I can change the rims on my car. I can buy aftermarket ones and slap it on there. That's what we're essentially allowed to do with these components of the gun outside of the frame itself.
Okay. I think you already described they can be assembled using hand tools. What are you illustrating here in slide number 5?
So this just illustrates a couple actual products that are out there for privately made firearms is one of the terms the slang is goes with. These products show some tooling that can be used to actually complete the manufacture and make the kit, which is sold into a functional frame that can be joined with a aftermarket slide and used as firearm.
You said there's two brands that are illustrated up there. What are the two brands?
These are two very common brands. One is at the bottom center is Polymer 80 with the P80 logo. There is another brand, the firearm is marketed as an SS80, and that's depicted in the top right portion of the slide.
Okay. All right, moving on. Would you discuss kind of the manufacture or the features of some of these ghost guns?
Right, so this image is depicting the fact that these kits are produced to mimic a typical gun that's already in mainstream production. So there are two actual models here that are listed there. On the left-hand side, there's a SS80 is one. There's a PF9SS. That's another. These two particular ghost gun frames are compatible with a particular model of Glock, and that Glock is called a Glock 43. So they are made to be sort of imitation frames of that Glock, and they're compatible with those aftermarket parts which are also compatible with that particular model of mainstream manufactured Glock.
So when you were first explaining to us how, or kind of the origins of what a ghost gun is, you contrasted that to a gun that came from a licensed manufacturer. Am I stating that correctly?
Yes.
Would the Glock 43 being produced by the Glock firearm company, would that be what you're talking about as being produced by a mainstream licensed manufacturer?
Yes.
And the ones that you have listed here on the left, the Polymer 80 PF9SS and the Glock SOAR SS80, would those be the ghost gun versions of a Glock 43?
Correct. These are the privately made firearm or ghost gun versions of the frame of a Glock 43.
Made to mimic a Glock 43?
Yes.
Okay. All right. What are you illustrating here?
So here it showed one set of aftermarket parts just illustrated there. The markings I have found on these evidence items can be linked to a particular aftermarket slide. This particular aftermarket slide is known to be compatible with a few models of firearm frames. These include the Glock 43, 43X, on the left-hand side, that's depicted by that dark black colored frame. On the right-hand side, the pink frame is representing the ghost gun equivalents of that Glock frame, which may be marketed as the SS80 or PF9SS.
Your explanation just now, you said the evidence items that you examined. Are you talking about these cartridge cases that were item 1 in that exhibit People's 32?
That's it.
Okay. And you're saying that the class characteristics that you saw on these cartridge cases, those three characteristics, that it was 9mm, that it had a teardrop-shaped aperture and a teardrop-shaped firing pin impression, those are the characteristics you were using to narrow it down to these 4 types of firearms?
Yes, that grouping of class characteristics is known to me through those resources. I've only been able to associate it with this one particular aftermarket slide. And this aftermarket slide is compatible just with a few styles of guns. The known brands and models are listed there.
Those 4, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's talk about your finding, or the conclusion to your analysis. Have you summarized your conclusion on this slide, People's 59? Go back to.
Yes. Final conclusion What you're not going to find in the report, I cannot say this configuration only comes from brand X. What we know is that after some considerable research, I can give you the list of candidates that we know to be consistent with these items. While these are consistent, we cannot really say that these are the only ones which will ever be manufactured with those general features. Due to that, the qualifying term, but not limited to, always appears in type and caliber findings, such as the ones I've produced.
So why is it, again, that you put that qualifying statement in your analysis? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but you stated 9mm is a very common caliber, correct?
Yes.
But at the end of your type and caliber analysis, you really narrowed it down to those three features were only really typical of 4 different firearms that you have seen come through your laboratory, through your research on the AFI resources, and cross-comparing that with NIBIN. Am I stating that accurately?
Yes. Based on the research that I've described, I have only encountered empirical evidence showing me that this grouping of class characteristics exists as a consequence of that particular aftermarket slide. That's all the information that I could determine after some relatively considerable evidence.
But you don't limit it to just those 4 firearms, fair to say?
Correct. You can't state that it's those 4 and only those 4, because these class characteristics are voluntarily chosen by the manufacturers. They can change. It's also possible that there are other items out there that we have not run into. Any research material I use is finite. So for that reason, we include that qualifying mark to be over.
But after your research in this area, you narrowed it to 4 that you, those 4 different firearms were the only that you could find that had those 3 class characteristics among them, correct?
Objection has the answer.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Your Honor. That's correct. I'm only aware of the aftermarket product that's compatible with those 4 models.
Okay, that's all I have, Your Honor.
All right, we'll take a 15-minute break.
Great,
Folks, please
break
be
and then
outside before
cross,
the
so-
doors at